Hello, everyone. Yet once again, it's another day of fresh grace and mercy. This is the Guilt, Grace, Gratitude podcast, where we bridge the gap to Reformed Christian theology for your listening pleasure. We are sponsored by Logos Bible Software. So, we're going to be doing a season 5 apologetics episode on Old Testament issues genocide. And we have Charlie Trimm on to help us with this conversation. We're having him on because he recently wrote a book called The Destruction of the Canaanites, God, Genocide, and the Biblical Interpretation. And it's published by Erdman's. So here for you guys on YouTube, here's what the book looks like. Go to our show notes, hit Erdman's link. You can get this book for yourself. And then also on our show notes, if you find the link to Confessional and Reformed Churches Church Finder, go ahead and hit that so you can find a local church near you or someone you know to find a Reformed or Confessional church near you. Also some information just how to communicate with us, find us on Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and of course email. So email's guiltgracepod@gmail.com. Instagram and Twitter is @guiltgracepod. And then of course, YouTube's pretty simple. You just type in our podcast name, Guilt, Grace, Gratitude Podcast, and you could subscribe to our show. I actually just found out recently, yesterday, you can hit a little button on YouTube on the video, and it shows the transcript of the video. So for our hearing impaired audience out there, you can actually read what we are saying in the episode. So it's really fantastic. We want to help out everyone with this stuff. So also some other information, just contacting Peter if you're interested in his church planting efforts. And then also the bridge builder group that we have is people and organizations that financially give to us to help our show grow. And as we are growing, we need more stuff and bandwidth and help. So if you're an individual, you can find out different levels of how to pay or give us some funds. And then you heard me earlier in the intro that Logos Bible Software is our main sponsor. So they are our main bridge builder out there. So thank you, Logos Bible Software. And then halfway through this episode, you'll hear words from some of our other sponsors / bridge builders. So we'll jump into this episode and let Peter further introduce Charlie Trimm.
Yeah, we have Dr. Charlie Trimm, who's Associate Professor of Biblical and Theological Studies at my alma mater, Talbot School of Theology, which is the graduate wing of Bible University, but kind of runs the undergraduate wing as well. He's a co-author with Brittany Kim of Understanding Old Testament Theology and the author of Fighting for the King and the Gods, a survey of warfare in the ancient Near East, and Yahweh Fights for Them, the Divine Warrior and Exodus narratives. And I want to give you a big thank you, first and foremost, just like Nick did, of writing a small book instead of a big book that we can digest a little bit easier. So thanks for coming on, Dr. Trimm.
Glad to be here, and happy that you're talking about the short book and not the 700-page book that I wrote.
That's right. Yeah, that's sometimes you got to be smart when you pick books that you need to read for shows. It's like, do I have time to read 700 pages or do I have the time to read 110? I was like, you know what? I think 110 works a little bit better for us.
Yeah.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah. Cool. So maybe, first question we'll ask is kind of the same question we ask most of our guests, actually all of our guests, is can you tell those who may not know you a little bit about yourself, your background, and what you do?
Yeah, I'm from the Seattle area, which means I miss the rain here in SoCal. It's
right.
far
You're
too
from
bright
where?
and sunny.
Yeah, well, not where Nick's from, but that's where Nick moved from.
Yeah.
I miss the green and the rain and everything. I get depressed here in the summer sometimes when I don't even see clouds for days on end. Need some rain. And then spent 5 years in Chicago getting a PhD from Wheaton College, and then I've been here at Biola for 10 years now. My main research interest is this topic, violence in particular, ethics in the Old Testament. So those are the kind of classes that I teach and tend to write on. My main writing project right now is a commentary on Exodus, which obviously there's a lot of violence there as well, so that overlaps. But I love the book of Exodus just on so many levels of what God has done for his people and how that's relevant for us today in so many ways. I'm also a director at organization I helped start called Every Voice, a Center for Kingdom Diversity and Christian Theological Education. And so we are just thinking about a variety of ways to be thinking about diversity in Christian theological education. The main contribution that we're going to have is a database of work by minority and global scholars. And for the Old Testament part is mostly up now. We're looking for funding for New Testament and theology in the future.
Awesome. That's awesome. Yeah, that's really cool. Before Nick starts his first question, because I don't think we have a really question on this, but what got you into this topic in the first place?
I drifted into it. My dissertation at Wheaton originally was going to be about intertextuality in Numbers and Deuteronomy, but that was too broad, and so we had to focus it. And so we focused it on the warfare text in the two books. But the more I studied the text, the more interested I got in the warfare part, and intertextuality just went by the wayside. And so my dissertation
warfare is a little more interesting than intertextuality.
So someday I need to make it back to intertextuality, but I haven't quite yet. So my dissertation was on God as a divine warrior in Exodus. And then from there, I wrote a kind of encyclopedia of violence in the ancient Near East with warfare in particular. And then as I started teaching on it, students, of course, started asking questions about the Canaanites. And so I started writing on that. And so this book is largely for my students to give them an overview of all the different work on this topic.
Awesome. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, because this topic specifically revolves around genocide, ethnic cleansing, and the Israelite conquests. Those are some terms we wanted to define for the audience on the front end, and then also the term harem that you mentioned in the book.
You gotta use the back of your throat, harem.
Harem. Yep. You provide, so you do help provide a definition, though you get some of the definitions from somewhere else and you cite them in the book and explain them, of genocide. Can you describe that for our listeners? I think that's the most important term, but those other ones I mentioned too, ethnic cleansing, harem. Hopefully I said that right.
Yeah, you got it. You got the little phlegm.
Harem. Yeah.
The more spit that comes out of your mouth, the better.
Yeah, if you're spitting on your microphone, you probably said it right.
Yep.
Right. Why is this term used for the Israelite conquest, specifically in Joshua, and why may it not be helpful for description for what occurs?
Yeah, the term genocide is a relatively recent term, coined about 100 years ago or so. Genocide scholars debate about what exactly it means, but it's generally agreed that genocide is not about numbers. It's not about how many people you kill, but it's about killing someone or removing their identity because of some kind of group identity. And so the most famous one, of course, is the Holocaust, where Hitler's focusing on removing the Jewish people in a variety of ways. And so genocide focuses on group identity. Ethnic cleansing is similar, but instead of trying to remove it altogether, they're being pushed out to a separate place so that one place can be free of the other identity. And the two often overlap because generally people don't like being pushed out. And so there's a violence usually is connected to it, but there's a slightly different emphasis between those two things. When it comes to the Old Testament and the Canaanites, there's a variety of different commands related to the Canaanites. Some sound more like ethnic cleansing of banish them, remove them from the land. But there's other commands that sound a little bit more closer to genocide, shall we say, of removing them permanently in some way. And harem might be one of those terms. Harem means to dedicate to Yahweh in some way. And so in some cases, it could be dedicate to Yahweh by giving it to a priest, and then the priest can use, say, the field or the item, whatever the case might be. However, if there's an Israelite idolater, someone who worships someone besides Yahweh, then they're said to be haremed, which presumably means they're to be killed. And in several places, especially in Deuteronomy, the Canaanites are also commanded to be haremed. And part of the conversation is, what exactly does that mean?
Yeah, before Nick asks his next question, just so people kind of get their minds wrapped around this, because I've heard or read some stuff that people will like lop all these terms together and they'll like kind of insert them all into harem. And it's like, well, harem means this when you in your book, and you point out some different views that we'll talk about later. And I've read other stuff. John Walton talks about this a little bit. Meredith Klein talks about this a little bit. A few other guys talk about this too. why may it not be helpful to kind of lop all these things into harem to say, oh, it's just for those who are outside of Israel? Because like you said, it's also for those who are Israelite idolaters.
Yeah, there's a strong stream in the Old Testament where it's not, say, Egypt or Canaan that's the enemy, it's sin that's the enemy.
Yeah.
And God's going to judge that wherever he finds it. And so we have the wilderness wanderings, for example, where God judges the Israelites, the end of Judges, where the Israelites become Canaanites in a sense. And the word harem is actually used in
Yep.
application to the Israelites.
Yeah, right at the
So
end, like
sin,
21. Yep.
yeah,
Right.
like really depressing Gibeah story.
Yep.
And so there's that sense of sin is the target, not necessarily some specific foreign country. And so harem is used in that sense to judge sin wherever God finds it.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's why it's helpful not to say like if it just means this, but like you said, there's some context that has a much broader or more specific focus that's not ethnic, it's sin. He's
Yeah.
exterminating sin.
Mhm.
Yeah. I think in the ancient Near East as a whole, genocide isn't really a word that fits because, like the Assyrians and the Egyptians, they don't care too much about group identity. Like they'll
Yeah.
kill lots of people, but
Yeah.
it's primarily because they're not giving them money. And as soon as you start giving Assyria money, then they'll stop killing you. And so it's
Yeah.
not like they have some vendetta against a particular group or anything like that.
Yeah.
And so the closest you could possibly find it in the ancient Near East is book of Joshua and the Canaanites, because even though it's not ethnicity of the Canaanites, because Rahab's a good counterexample there and several others,
Yep.
Caleb, but religion is clearly an issue. And so all the Canaanite commands, even though they don't all use harem or anything consistent like that, they all talk about Canaanite religion being the problem. And so that's the focus of harem, is the Canaanite religion.
Gotcha.
Mhm. Yeah, and the first part of your book is super helpful, explaining the history and context of, taking us to the place and time of all this and the ancient Near East. So you're taking us back there, talking about the context, and what was really helpful is you explaining how ancient Near East context describes warfare. What's going on when one group takes over another group, and the hyperboles of a lot of kings. What they do, they would even exaggerate claims like saying, they would say like we wiped out everybody, but really all they did was maybe wipe out just barely that army they fought. I mean, those people are still around that that army was representing that got beat or something like that. That's kind of like a loose, generic explanation of what you're saying, ancient Near East stuff. So, based on that, could you kind of maybe describe the context, the history of the ancient Near East, what's going on to kind of lay the foundation of the rest of your book, and who the Canaanites are? Where did they descend from, biblically?
Yeah, so the first three chapters of my book is this background. The first chapter in particular is the summary of my 700-page book. So it's all about just a summary of warfare in the ancient Near East, how it works. The most relevant part, Nick, as you mentioned, is the hyperbole, where kings often talk about their victories very hyperbolically. So they never mention their defeats. They never even mention any casualties on their sides, and they always win in dramatic ways. And so they however, they also don't make up battles, as far as we can tell. Like they're at least honest in that sense. So they just exaggerate, shall we say, their victories, and then just don't talk about their defeats. And so this is how you talk about warfare in the ancient Near East. And so when Joshua talks about warfare, then we should expect at least some influence from this genre. The background of the Canaanites in particular, they occupy the land as to the east of the Mediterranean Sea, west of the Jordan River. And according to the Old Testament, there's a person named Canaan with this bizarre story. He's the grandson of Noah. And there's a cursing of Canaan. It's strange, and the more you dig into it, the stranger it gets. But something bad happens involving Canaan, and so Canaan is cursed because of that. And then they live in this land. They're there when Abraham shows up much later on. And we have references to the Canaanites from outside the Old Testament. They start appearing in ancient Eastern literature about 1500 BC. and then they disappear about 1,000 years later. And so it's a historically attested group living in this place. And so that's a little bit of the background of who the Canaanites are.
Maybe to fill in that a little bit before we go into the next part. What specifically in the Old Testament, like, do we find these commands to say, like, hey, go take over this land, go take over this people? It seems to be most kind of in front of scholars, like, what do we do with this?
Yeah, it gradually intensifies throughout the Torah. So in Genesis, we have lots of interactions between the patriarchs and the Canaanites. Some are positive, some are negative, some are very negative. There's the first reference to the iniquity of the Canaanites in Genesis 15 that is not yet complete. But besides that, there's not very much in Genesis. In Exodus, as the Israelites are leaving Egypt and coming back, we begin to get Canaanite commands, Exodus 23 in particular, about removing the Canaanites, banishing the Canaanites. Leviticus talks about how the land is going to vomit the Canaanites out, which is some pretty graphic imagery. Numbers 33 has similar terminology to Exodus, and then Deuteronomy introduces the cherem language. Deuteronomy 7, Deuteronomy 20, with removing Canaanite religion again.
Yeah, and if you don't mind, because you pretty much answered my next question, which is good. You're helping explain why you wrote this book and some ancient Near Eastern background. So I'm going to replace it with a small question too. That would be, you're saying Canaanites were the descendant from the grandson of Noah. I think they're from the line of Ham, right? So yeah, there's like a curse that's upon them, and they weren't the original inhabitants of that land, right? There was people before the Canaanites where they were, right?
That part's a little unclear. So
Okay.
it's possible. So one of the theories is, in a sense, this land always belonged to descendants of Seth, and the descendants of Canaan stole it. But all of that isn't really fleshed out for us very well in the Old Testament. So we just don't know. It's possible, but we're not sure.
And
I'll add a quick question to Nick's question too, just to orient our listeners to the time of biblical history that this occurs. Like when is the I guess, for lack of better terms, when's the most like intense form of this? Like what part of biblical history are we talking about that they're trying to take over the land of the Canaanites?
Yeah, in biblical terms, canonical terms, this is the book of Joshua. And so after the 40 years wandering in the wilderness, they enter the land of Canaan. And so this is the primary point. There's one or two cases afterwards. 1 Samuel 15, for example, with Saul and the Amalekites, cherem is used again at that point, but it's primarily Joshua. The specific date is unclear depending on how you date the Exodus. So either 1200, 1400 BC, somewhere around there.
Gotcha. Yeah. So this is, for lack of a better term, is after the law is given, whenever that occurs on Sinai, and then they're in the book of Numbers, they're looking down at the land. At the end of Deuteronomy, they're kind of looking down the land, and Moses dies at the top of the hill, and then so they go into the book of Joshua. So Joshua is the time this occurs after giving the laws. They're trying to figure out, how do we apply the law to this land mandate, to this mandate to exterminate, but to set up like this holy ground, this holy land for the Lord.
Yeah.
And real quick before Peter goes, why you mentioned Rahab? Why is Rahab important for this context?
Yeah, she's the clearest example that ethnicity is not the problem. It doesn't matter who you descend from. What matters is your relationship with Yahweh. And so she helps the two scouts and protects them and appears to have some kind of faith in Yahweh. And so she is saved, becomes part of Israel. And so that's the best example that the focus is not ethnicity, but religion.
Okay, cool.
And to orient my next question, I'll provide some background and kind of a question before my question. We're adding a lot more small questions. This is a hard topic for a lot of people to kind of wrap their minds around. So I think it's helpful. But why has kind of ethnic cleansing, genocide, why have those all been kind of, maybe more so lately, kind of bunched up into this term of cherem? And maybe what's not the history of it necessarily, but why has this all kind of come into this one thing? Why is it kind of assumed that this is what's happening in the Old Testament?
There's a variety of reasons for that. To some extent, the new atheists, Richard Dawkins and so on, popularized a lot of the arguments against the Bible by portraying the God of the Old Testament in particular as this pretty horrible guy. So maybe some of that. I think it perhaps correlates with greater attention to colonialism and culture as a whole. So thinking about the negative effects of colonialism on, say, Africa and Asia, and grappling with some of that. It's hard to think about that and then not also think about what's going on in the Old Testament. And just the rise of the nuns in general, of those leaving the faith.
Not Catholic nuns, but nuns.
Correct, the None,
Yeah.
those who have no religion. So this is often an issue with them as well. So previously in the past, that group might have been culturally Christian, go to church on Christmas and Easter, not really thought about these kind of topics, but now they have more formally left the church, and these topics are more in the conversation. So I think a variety of reasons why it's more prominent now.
Gotcha. Yeah, because it's you don't trace this history necessarily, and I'm sure others do, but there does seem to be kind of like a renewed interest in, like, oh, actually, what is going on in the conquest, where before it doesn't seem like as much. I mean, if you read Wellhausen or a couple of guys, like they talk about it a little bit, but not as kind of pointed as they do today, or kind of include some of this stuff into it. So that gets into some of the questions on part 2 of your book. So what are the different, because there's a couple different views on what's happening in the conquest and how to understand the Old Testament, what's happening, the words, is this actual history, is God actually bad, what do we do some of this stuff. So what are some of the different views of what's happening in the conquest and the Old Testament in general, the Old Testament account, and how do, and we don't want to say, like, obviously some have more problems than others do. So, but then how do they help us maybe better read the text versus just saying, like, oh, they're terrible, which, yes, some of them are not very good readers of the text, but how do they help us better read the text of this account?
Yeah, I divide it into 4 different views. So the first one is kind of the new atheist approach, where you look at God and you see God as being really violent, and your response to that is you just reject the package altogether, the entire religion package. And so Bible, God, religion, you just cut it all out because God is violent. So this is the one view in the book that I explicitly reject. Like, as a Christian, I'm not a fan of this, but this is a pretty common view in our time.
I know you've gotten a little bit of flack that you didn't take a stance, but at least you do take a stance against something.
Yes, this first view I do reject.
Yeah, exactly.
In the book. The second view disconnects God from violence. And so the scholars in this group want to keep their faith in God, but they don't want to attribute this violence to God. And so in a variety of ways, they find methods to disconnect God from violence. So, like, one simple one, like you're mentioning, is to say these are not historical events. And so this ties in with some historical criticism that says, the Battle of Jericho didn't happen, and so on. And so that could be a way forward ethically as well, to say, if this event didn't happen, then we don't need to worry about the ethics of it. Yeah. Or you could say, just intuitively, we know genocide's wrong. And so, as our God-given human ability to see sin clearly, we are expected to read the Bible a certain way. And so we should reject genocide, even if the Bible says it's from God. And so we should assume this is a mistake on the ancient Israelites' part or something like that, and just use our moral intuition to reject it.
It's almost like God didn't really command genocide, but the Israelites went ahead with it anyways.
Exactly. And then the most sophisticated way forward in this category is to think about Jesus as a lens, which that's obviously a New Testament theme. You want to know who God is, you look at Jesus. So Eric Seibert and others have said, well, Jesus is pretty pacifistic in the Gospels. He's not beating people up and so on. And so if Jesus is pacifistic, then that reveals God to us. And so we can then understand the Old Testament presentation of God as a non-violent one. And so all the places where God is violent, we have to either chop those off or understand it in a different way or something like that.
And then I think this one doesn't necessarily hit one, but you also talk about the potential that the genocide is not specifically just killing, it's just pushing from the land. That comes from a few different scholars. So maybe if you can talk a little bit about those who'd say, yeah, genocide is not killing, it's just removing. Does that make sense?
So this would be category 3. So these scholars basically say if you read the text correctly, it's really not that violent. It's not genocide, it's not terrible violence. And so they solve the ethical problem via biblical interpretation. And so there's no special ethical defense needed. You just read it correctly. And so one way forward, like you talked about, Peter, is the banishing focus. And there's several commands that use the word banish, like Aresh and a few others. And so the focus then is it's not genocide. We're just removing them to a different place, and there's a few places in Joshua and Judges where that kind of language is used. So that does seem to be part of what happened. Of course, part of this is it doesn't solve the ethical problem per se, because now we just have ethnic cleansing instead of genocide, which I think is better ethically for most people, but it's still quite ethically problematic. So it might be part of a way forward, but not necessarily the sole solution.
I see.
Yeah, and real quick, something I find really interesting too. Generally speaking, we don't question if God is cruel or bad or anything like that when we come across the flood with Noah. We don't really question God being cruel when it comes to Exodus and the plagues in Egypt. But yet, this seems to be different. This seems to trigger a different chord reaction to people. What's going on there?
Yeah, the core difference, I think, is the actor. So in the flood in particular, with the plagues, although with both of them, there's more and more attention being given to the ethics of that as well, especially the 10th plague, the firstborn of Egypt dying. That's attracting more and more attention. So one of the projects I'm working on right now is a discussion of the ethics of that, various approaches to how we think about the 10th plague, what is God doing there. But the key difference between those on the one hand and the Canaanite conquest on the other hand is the actor, because in the Canaanite conquest, it's Israelite soldiers who are acting a certain way. And we're expected to think that Israelite soldiers are off killing these innocent people. And I think that is significantly more difficult to swallow, as well as the connection with colonialism today, where it just gets difficult to praise Israelites who are acting like the colonizers that we condemn in other contexts. So it just feels more similar to contemporary issues than, say, the flood does.
Maybe if you can talk to as well, and I've read this in other places as well as yours, but as far as people can tell, they're not exterminating, quote unquote, Canaanites because they're under the covenant mandate of Israel, because they're not under the same covenant. They're not under a covenant that Israel's under. So maybe, and I've read this in a couple other places. So like maybe if you can describe maybe the difference between Canaan and Israel, because some people may say, like, how are they different? Like what's going on to Canaan that's not actually happening to Israel, or sometimes it happens in Israel, not actually Canaan. So maybe if you can describe that difference too.
Sure. Just to frame it a little bit, we're now in the 4th category, which is basically defending God in his Canaanite commands. Like, why is this okay for this particular event? The one who's focused in particular on that is the Walton's book, John Walton and his son Harvey Walton, and they argue strongly that Canaan is not being judged for their sin because they're under a different relationship with God and so on. To some extent, I think that's the case, but I think they take it too far. I think there's still a sense where all humans are liable to judgment.
I have that same exact critique of the book.
So there's some helpful things. I like their definition of cherem, in particular, the denouncing rather than killing. But I'm not as persuaded by saying just because they're not under a covenant with Yahweh like Israel is means they, in a sense, get a free pass. So I think there's enough text, especially in the Pentateuch, that connect the Canaanites with wickedness. Now, on the other hand, I don't think Canaan is more wicked than anyone else. I don't think you can make that argument. I think it's tied to the land in particular. where this land is promised to Israel. And so that is why Canaan is the recipient of these commands and not, say, Babylon or Egypt or something like that. And so that is the one-time nature of this, is that it's the focus on the land.
Yeah.
And if there is some connection in the past with the curse of Canaan, did they steal this land from Seth? Possibly. Like, those are some interesting parallels, possibly.
Okay. Gotcha. Yeah. So that, and I think that helps orient this a little bit, because we're not saying that Canaan is worse or they sinned more than Israel, so they're exterminated from the land. Because it's like I preach from Judges, and you've talked about Judges. It's very clear at the end of Judges that nobody else is being exterminated besides Israel. So it's not tied specifically to Canaan, but like you said, it seems to be tied to the land and whatever relationship is happening there. And I agree with you, because I read the Walton book right after I read yours to figure out, like, what did they actually say? And I found myself agreeing with your account on your fourth view, because you're like, yeah, I think they take this covenant differentiation a little bit too far, where they say it kind of like you can kind of make the argument based off their book, and obviously we don't have them as a conversation partner to talk to them and say, what do you actually believe? But it does seem like they say Canaan's under nothing effectively, when it does seem pretty clear, like you said, from the Pentateuch, from kind of the moral covenant, this thing that's written on our hearts, that no, they're subject to something. It's not the same written law that Israelites have, but they're subject to something. So there has to be something there. So that's helpful. So maybe to tie it even clear and be more concise, Canaan is not of the same people as Israel. They're not like the same people group, right?
Correct. Although they do speak probably the same language. So there's some connections there. But yeah, they're a very different ethnicity background.
Gotcha. Yes. And that's helpful for those who have no Bible backgrounds. Like, who the heck are the Canaanites? Who are the Israelites? Like, why does this even matter? So they're not the same. Yeah. They speak the same language probably, but not the same kind of background. And then you talk about this difference too, or possible difference. Maybe there's no difference. Is there a difference between genocide and ethnic cleansing? Like, should we kind of put a fine-tuned fork between that, a fine-tuned brush between that? And is that, and I know you don't take a specific view in the book necessarily, although you can kind of tell based off your writing, like, what you're closer to than what you're not closer to. But you don't have to take a stance here necessarily. But is that what's happening in Joshua? Are they doing it because they're foreigners? They don't like the color of their skin. They think they're bad people. Is that what's happening in Joshua?
Well, since the book's published, I don't mind telling you what I actually think.
Oh, there we go.
I reject the second view as well, because of the issues related to the Bible. Everyone in the second category almost rejects inerrancy, has a lower view of Scripture, especially the Old Testament, than I would like. And even beyond that, I don't find the arguments persuasive to reject the connection between God and violence. I think you basically have to take a universalistic God and reject eschatological violence as well, if you're going to go that direction. And so there's a lot of,
just means like end time. Everybody who doesn't believe is going to be consigned to hell. Those who do believe will be in heaven.
Correct. So I don't find that view persuasive, but I didn't say my view about it in the book because I wanted to leave that open, because I do think it's a much better option than category one. And so I wanted to expand the horizon of the possible readership of the book by saying, like, that one is still an open possibility. Category 3, I think, is helpful. Like, hyperbole is clearly there. There's clear examples in Joshua 10:20 is probably the clearest example. It says they slaughtered them all, and the remnant went back to their cities. So, like, clearly, like, there's something going on here. And so I think hyperbole definitely helps, especially when it comes to, like, the heart of the problem that we think of with killing of the innocents. Like, I think the majority of it was probably military battles. But I don't think it solves the problem ethically. Like, I don't think you can just say, yeah, it's only ethnic cleansing, we're all good, right? Like, that, I don't think is something that solves the problem for me finally. So I think it's a helpful part, but I think the category 4 arguments defending God's actions in some way are needed as well. And so the banishing to a separate country, that is certainly something that's there, but I don't think it solves the problem by itself.
Yeah, and I think even though you don't explicitly say it in the book, a perceptive reader, I think, catches this. You critique view 4 less than you do the
Yeah.
first 3. So I know because I read some reviews on the book, and I know you got some flack for like, oh, he doesn't take a view, so he's just kind of leaving this and runs and just lets us to figure this stuff out. But if you read closely, you can see what Dr. Trimm is talking about. I think it's really helpful because you definitely do see this in Joshua, you see this in Judges, where they're not always killing. It's just and if they don't do this, what I find interesting too, fascinating, if you want to maybe talk about this, if Israel doesn't do this, it actually happens to them. Is that right?
Yeah, and like we've been talking about the end of Judges, also the entire exile is kind of, in a sense, a cherem as well, of renewing the land from generations of sin. And so there's several spots along the way in Israelite history in the Old Testament where their sin is judged in a similar way to Canaanite sin being judged.
Yeah. And maybe I don't know, Nick, if you're thinking about this too, but maybe to assume you're killing innocent people, you lose a doctrine of sin. You lose a doctrine of we're born in sin, so it's not like killing one innocent group versus another, but it could be they would say like, well, they don't have a covenant on them, so they don't have the same kind of stipulations or mandates that Israel does. Is that also maybe getting into some of the stuff where there's maybe a kind of a wonky view of sin and like who's actually innocent in this case?
Yeah, we could think about that. This is where something like the flood complicates things.
Yeah.
So it's hard to have a hyperbolic reading of the flood and say, yeah, it's only those who truly sinned and all the innocents were
Noah
saved,
sins.
something like that.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's a variety. Like the picture as a whole, the Old Testament, I think this is where it's important to think about that and put this in the context of what God is doing in calling Israel and everything. So we haven't talked about this yet, but the view in view 4 that I find most persuasive and helpful is the eschatological perspective of thinking about
the Kleinian perspective.
Yeah, he's the one who talks about it
Intrusion
initially.
ethics and all that stuff.
Yeah, where we all face judgment in the end times, but with the Canaanite conquest, the eschatological judgment is brought into history. Like in a sense, it comes early for them. So it's not unfair in that sense. They're not facing something that no one else does, but this judgment is brought into history. And so in the New Testament, we see the land of Canaan with positive eschatological connotations where New Jerusalem and so on, connections between the land and new creation. You cross the Jordan River to get to new creation and so on. And so I see the destruction of the Canaanites as kind of the negative side of that, the judgment of evildoers who are seeking to prevent new creation from happening. That's what's going on with the destruction of the Canaanites, is removing those voices that want to stop new creation. And so putting it in the broader picture of what God is doing in the world, connecting it with things like the flood and the Exodus, God's plan of calling Israel, calling the world through Israel that Chris Wright talked about so well, Mission of God. Others, putting it in that perspective, I think really helps me with thinking about what God is doing in the story.
You made my West Cal heart very, very glad because we're Kleinian to the core. So it's you make my heart sing.
Real quick, yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because I was starting to think, talking about covenant, the Canaanites aren't under covenant, but they are under the Noahic covenant of the common grace, the entire world. And so what that means is it's, delaying final judgment for the world. But yet we see God ordained, almost kind of like a early, dare I say, early judgment, within the Noahic covenant in the Old Testament. So I think the way you could maybe clean up what I said so I don't confuse anybody, but that's kind of helpful where if you understand the context of this is post flood, so this is under the Noahic covenant, and then there's the destruction of the Canaanites, and then you're thinking, well, like, why is that happening under the Noahic covenant? Okay, I'm pointing towards some sort of maybe typological eschatology that's going on. And what typologically just means it's pointing forward to final judgment.
Yeah, one of the things I do in my classes on this topic is look at all of the divine violence in the Old Testament that God does. There's only like maybe 10 cases or so. The flood is the most prominent one at the beginning, but the second one is Sodom and Gomorrah. And so that kind of heightens that question, Nick, you were just talking about of, wait, God promised he wouldn't flood the world. Like, what's he doing with Sodom and Gomorrah? But I think the answer is he still cares about sin. Just because he's promised not to judge the world through the flood doesn't mean it's a free pass, do whatever you want. And so some of the later cases of divine violence are emphasizing that as well as doing other things. Like the Exodus is a clear case of rescuing those who are suffering oppression, as well as the connection between God and his people. And so each case of divine violence, I think God is doing it specifically, making a statement in some way. And so this plays into that trend in the Old Testament.
Yeah, that's helpful. Maybe to to clear up the language for those who are like eschatological judgment. Or that's correct me if I'm wrong, but that's bringing future stuff right now. So it's saying, yes, this is coming in the end, but I'm going to give you a little bit of preview what this judgment is going to look like. Is that right?
Yeah.
Cool. Just so people have some bearings around, like they're like eschatological judgment. That's a big word I was not expecting to hear in this episode. So that's good. So last question, unless you have anything that you want to end on, or Nick has another question. So we've talked about those who struggle with this. It's obvious that people have struggled with this portion of biblical history, and it's not like we don't. It's just maybe we struggle with it a little bit less, although we still kind of have the same questions. And those who might see this as possibly the most barbaric part of the Old Testament, they're like, and this is why they look at the Old Testament like that God's different than the New Testament God, because he kills and he punishes, and it, like I said, it sure seems that Jesus is pacifistic, and I don't know if I can take this thing. So they lop off this, and so they can't take the whole. So we need to move on for this. So how much you approach this portion of biblical history in light of the whole, to both those who have who believe, like, yes, I know the Bible is inerrant, it's the word of God, but this is still a really hard portion of the Bible. And those who look at this portion of the Bible is like, yep, nope, I'm not down with this. I can't believe this. I can't believe God would kill people, these innocent people. So how much you talk to both of these, kind of with these views in mind, and now that you've written a book and you've researched this a little bit more?
Yeah, maybe three thoughts in closing. One is I still struggle with this. I'm I suppose one of the experts on this, since I've written a book on it, but I still struggle with it. I still have difficulties with it. And that's kind of why I didn't say more about my view. Partly at a practical level, the point of my book is not to defend what I'm saying, but to help people navigate what everyone else is saying, because there's all these different voices and they're all saying different things and so on. But also just to emphasize how I don't necessarily have it all answered. And the book is more an invitation to join the struggle rather than let me tell you what the answer is so you can end the struggle. Like let's walk through the struggle together of trying to think through what's happening. Secondly, something that's been really impactful for me in my life, and something we don't talk about very much in the church today, is lament, where we come to God and we say hard things to God. And the Psalms give us a basis for this. Usually it's things going on in our life where we bring it to God and say, like, I'm really struggling with this. Where are you, God? Like, why have you abandoned me? And so on. But I think there might be some ground for biblical text as well, coming to God and saying, why did you write it this way? Like, why did you act this way? And the beauty of the laments is it gives us a place to talk about these things to God, to be honest with our feelings, because of course God knows it already. Like we can't hide that from God. But the laments give us a form that brings us to a place of trust. And so we can lament these biblical texts that we might struggle with. And through the laments, they help us come to a place where we can trust God. And so even though the laments don't necessarily show us the correct answer, or life doesn't necessarily get better, but it brings us to a place of trusting God. So I think that's important as well. And then the third is a reminder of what's the bar to follow God, in a sense. And the parallel I use here is the New Testament story where Jesus commands the crowd, eat my flesh and drink my blood. And a whole bunch of people leave because that's really disgusting. And he looks at his disciples and says, are you guys going to leave too? And the subtext, I feel like the disciples are saying, I kind of want to, like, I don't know what the world you're talking about. But Peter says, you have the words of life. And I think that is such a profound statement of, I don't know what you're talking about, Jesus, but where else am I going to go? Like, you have the words of life. I'm going to trust that these are part of those words of life, even though I don't understand it. And so I think that's a helpful pattern for us as we look at these texts in the Old Testament and other difficult areas of apologetics, to say, I don't necessarily have an answer, God, but I know you have the words of life, and I'm going to keep on following you, even though I don't necessarily have it all worked out for myself.
Yeah. I remember reading that part in your book and it really helping, because I was thinking, you know what? God knows the full picture of everything, past, present, future, everything. He knows exactly what our destiny and what's happening right after we die. He understands everything. He lives outside of time, and we don't. We don't know. And so we don't know if the destruction of the Canaanites didn't happen, how that changes things. So it had to happen for redemptive history. And there has to be a level of like, it seems really weird right now, but we'll know the answer when we're in heaven and on the last day and all that. But God knows. We have to know that he is truth, and he is everything, and he is the creator of everything. So we have to know that, as weird as it is, we know that that was the only way.
Yeah. Correct. That's we we can look for answers like your book. We can search for answers, we can research, and we can get as close to it. And this is not a call to say like, well, the answer's not out there, so might as well not try for it. And this is kind of an open faith that you can believe whatever you want to believe. We can search for answers. We may not find the fullest answer that we can fully comprehend. It makes us feel fully good about this stuff, but we can get close and we can say like, I think this is what the biblical text is saying, but this is also not hinging my salvation. This is not also hinging anything like that's first order. It's as long as I believe that God inspired this through his spirit, that this is the text that we have, and we have to deal with this. And I know God is good. I'm not really sure what he's doing in some of these texts, but I know God is good. And so he's got to have some reason for doing this stuff. And it's maybe not a satisfying answer for some people. But it is, I think, maybe like you said, and it's kind of the ultimate answer. We don't know. We have a good idea, but that doesn't give us license to just like kind of skirt this topic and not talk about it, which, like you said, tends not to be talked about in churches, tends not to be talked about between Christians. They're not like the first question when you go to lunch with your friend is like, what do you think about the Canaanite story? Talk about like, hey, what do you think about predestination, or like some
you
fun
haven't had lunch with me
about the Canaanite story? Yeah, unless you talk to Nick, then yeah, Nick wants to talk about Canaanite destruction. But yeah, I think it's a helpful call out for us, and helpful to kind of orient ourselves around this. This is, and I think we've gotten more into this a little bit more lately on, let's ask the hard questions, because if we don't ask the hard questions now, like you said, they're going to come up later. And are we asking them now to kind of build ourselves up, or are we going to deal with an article that we read in the New York Times or with some believer who may have a better understanding, and they kind of make us fall flat on our feet? Like, I don't know. I have no idea what to think about this. Or we think like, I can only bring God my good thoughts. I can only bring God the things that I think are happy, versus like, no, I can actually go to God with my Christ.
And just for the record, it sounds like you're more on category 4 with a little sprinkle of hyperbole in there.
Sprinkle of hyperbole. Yeah.
Is that right?
Awesome. Well, Dr. Trimm, thank you so much for coming on, talking about this. If it's not the thorniest topic in the Old Testament, it's one of the thorniest topics in the Old Testament. So thanks for putting the research into it, for writing this book, for writing a short book, not a long book. That'll be helpful. So those who are looking for some bearings, I would very much encourage people to pick up this book and read through it. It's a short read. Like Nick said, it's easy to get through. Thanks for coming on. Thanks for talking about this. Looking forward to the work that you have coming up in the future.
Thanks for the conversation. That was fun.
Thank you.